The sky above Deathworld 7 was a storm of fire and smoke. Explosions rattled the ground, shaking the mountains like they were made of sand. The planet had always been dangerous, but now it was a battlefield, a place where humanity was making its last stand. Captain Elias Work stood on the edge of a ruined watchtower, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. What he saw made his heart pound. The auxiliary warships hovered like black shadows against the sky, their massive cannons glowing with energy. Below them, thousands of alien soldiers marched forward, their armor reflecting the dim red light of the dying sun. Humanity was outnumbered. Again. Elias clenched his fists. This wasn't just another battle. This was the end, unless he did something insane. A voice crackled over the radio. "Captain Rourke, the auxiliary commander is demanding a response." Elias sighed. Of course they were. The auxiliary loved to give their enemies a chance to surrender before crushing them. He grabbed the radio and spoke. "Put him through." A deep, growling voice filled the air. "Humans, your resistance is pointless. Your cities have fallen. Your armies are gone. Surrender now, and we may let some of you live." Elias smirked. "That's a generous offer." The auxiliary commander laughed, a rough metallic sound. "You think you have a choice. We have 1,000 warships. You have a handful of broken tanks. Surrender, and I might even let you serve us." Elias looked around. His soldiers were battered and exhausted. Their weapons were old, their supplies almost gone. Logically, they should have lost already. But humans had never been logical in war. Elias took a deep breath and spoke into the radio. "I have a counteroffer. Come and get us." Then he turned off the radio. Commander Sarah Vance, his second-in-command, stepped forward. "Elias, tell me you have a plan." He smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I have something better." Sarah crossed her arms. Something better than a plan. Elias turned to the soldiers behind him. Their faces were hard, determined. These weren't just warriors. These were the last defenders of humanity. "We can't win by fighting fair. The auxiliary expect us to stand and fight. But we're going to do something they won't expect." Lieutenant Briggs, a large soldier with a scar across his face, frowned. "You mean run?" Elias shook his head. "No. We're going to lure them into a trap." He pointed toward the wastelands beyond the base, a land of poison air, shifting sands, and creatures so deadly even the auxiliary feared them. Sarah's eyes widened. "You want to lead them into the dead zone?" Elias nodded. "Exactly. They think they're hunting us, but in reality, they'll be walking into their own grave." The soldiers exchanged glances. It was a suicide mission. The dead zone had swallowed entire armies before, but then again, so had humanity. Elias stepped forward. "Listen to me. If we stand here, we die. If we fight them head-on, we die. But if we make them chase us into the dead zone, we might just have a chance." Briggs grinned. "Crazy enough to work." Elias smirked. "That's the idea." The auxiliary didn't wait long. Within an hour, their ships opened fire. Huge energy blasts struck the base, turning steel into molten slag. The humans ran, diving into the shadows of the wastelands. The plan had begun. As expected, the auxiliary followed. They weren't just invading anymore. They wanted to exterminate. Elias and his team moved fast, racing through the ruins, past broken ships and crumbling towers. The auxiliary war machines rumbled behind them, their gunfire tearing apart the ground. Then the first sign of the planet's rage appeared. A deep rumble echoed through the earth. The ground cracked open, revealing a pit of molten lava. Several auxiliary tanks didn't stop in time. They tumbled forward, vanishing into the fiery abyss. Elias grinned. "That's one." Sarah looked at him. "You planned that." Elias shrugged. "I just knew this planet hates everyone equally." The auxiliary hesitated, but only for a moment. More of them came, their troops marching forward into the darkness. They didn't know it yet, But they had already lost. The auxiliary forces advanced, their metal boots pounding against the rocky wasteland. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the ground trembled beneath their weight. Their commander, General Vorik, watched from his hovering command ship, his sharp, insectoid eyes scanning the battlefield. Humans were running. That was expected. They always ran. But something about this retreat felt different. It wasn't the blind, desperate fleeing of a broken army. It was too organized. Vorik narrowed his eyes. Increase pursuit speed. Do not let them regroup. The auxiliary soldiers obeyed, moving forward with terrifying efficiency. Warships followed overhead, their weapons primed. The humans had nowhere to run. Or so Vorik thought. Elias and his team sprinted through the wasteland, their breath ragged, their bodies aching. Every second counted. Behind them, the auxiliary were closing in. The sound of energy blasts grew louder, turning the landscape into a burning graveyard. Sarah ran beside Elias, keeping pace. We're not going to outrun them forever. Elias smirked, despite the situation. We don't need to outrun them. We just need them to follow us a little longer. Ahead, the terrain grew more treacherous. The ground was cracked and uneven, steam rising from deep fissures. The dead zone was near, a place where nothing lived. And that was exactly where they needed to go. Briggs, who had been covering their flank, glanced over his shoulder. They're pushing hard. They're too aggressive. Elias nodded. That's the plan. Briggs gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue. Everyone trusted Elias because he had a way of making the impossible work. Suddenly, an explosion sent them flying. The shockwave knocked Elias off his feet, slamming him into a rock. His ears rang. He tasted blood. Sarah pulled him up. We need to move. The auxiliary had fired a targeted strike. They weren't playing anymore. Elias shook off the pain and signaled his team. Go dark. No transmissions. No signals. We disappear now. One by one, the soldiers activated their cloaking devices, a crude but effective human invention. It didn't make them invisible, but it masked their heat signatures and made it harder for scanners to detect them. The auxiliary wouldn't realize their prey had vanished. Not yet. From the auxiliary warships, General Vorik watched the human forces disappear into the dead zone. His mandibles clicked in frustration. A nearby officer turned. Sir, they're scattering. Should we hold position? Vorik's eyes glowed a deep red. No, we push forward. There is no escape. The auxiliary war machines rolled into the wasteland, their numbers overwhelming. But as soon as they crossed into the dead zone, something changed. The ground beneath them shifted. A strange low-frequency hum filled the air. Something unnatural, something old. Then the first auxiliary soldier screamed. Vorik's attention snapped to his monitors. One of his best warriors had been dragged underground. The cameras flickered, barely catching the movement. Long, spindly limbs covered in dark chitin, pulling the auxiliary down into the darkness. The soldiers hesitated. Vorik growled. Ignore it. Move forward. The auxiliary did as they were told, but now something was hunting them. Elias crouched on a ledge, watching from a distance. His plan had worked. They had lured the auxiliary into the hunting grounds of the planet's deadliest creatures. He smiled grimly. Let's see how they handle a real fight. The screams of the auxiliary echoed across the wasteland. The disciplined march of their army had dissolved into chaos. Soldiers fired wildly into the darkness, their weapons lighting up the craggy landscape, but nothing stopped the creatures that lurked below. Elias crouched behind a boulder, watching through his visor's night vision display. His team was spread out, hidden in the rocky cliffs surrounding the battlefield. The auxiliary had no idea what they had walked into. Briggs, perched on a ridge nearby, muttered over their closed comms channel. Damn, whatever those things are, they're making a mess down there. Elias smirked. Good. The more chaos, the better. But we're not done yet. Sarah, hiding just a few feet from him, glanced over. They still outnumber us 100-1. What's the next step? Elias checked his wrist display. Their window was closing fast. If the Xilari regrouped, they'd have to deal with the monsters and an enemy army. That wasn't an option. We pushed them over the edge. Briggs chuckled. You mean metaphorically, right? Elias grinned. Nope. General Vorik slammed his fist against the control panel. This was impossible. His warriors were being slaughtered, not by the humans, but by creatures they didn't even know existed. The battlefield was in shambles. Warriors had stopped advancing. Their discipline had collapsed as soldiers scrambled to avoid the massive shadowed figures that moved through the dust and smoke. Some Xilari had tried retreating, but that only made them easier prey. Vorik turned to his second-in-command. Where is my air support? The officer hesitated. Our targeting systems are malfunctioning, sir. There's interference. Vorik's eyes narrowed. Interference. That shouldn't be possible. The Xilari's technology was flawless. But then something strange appeared on his display. A signal. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. Vorik growled. The humans. They had planned this. He turned to his comms officer. Override all ground unit commands. Force them to advance. Full charge. The officer hesitated for half a second too long. Vorik's blade was at his throat before he could blink. Do it. Now. The order was sent. The Xilari forces had no choice but to comply. The charge resumed. And that was exactly what Elias had been waiting for. From his position on the ridge, Elias activated his visor's command interface. His heart pounded as he watched the Xilari forces push forward, stepping deeper into the nightmare. They had taken the bait. With a few quick commands, he signaled his squad. All units, set charges. Now. Scattered around the battlefield, hidden beneath the shifting ground, were detonation points, carefully planted days ago. The Xilari thought they had walked into a natural predator's lair. But they were wrong. Elias had built it. A trap designed not just to weaken the enemy, but to break them. Sarah exhaled sharply as she armed the detonator next to her. You sure about this, Elias? Elias locked eyes with her. Nope. He grinned. But it's crazy enough to work. Briggs' voice crackled over the comms. All set on my end. Elias took a deep breath, then gave the order. Detonate. The first explosion sent a shockwave through the valley. A second later, the ground collapsed. The Xilari warriors, already fighting for their lives, suddenly found the earth vanishing beneath them. Sinkholes erupted across the battlefield, swallowing entire battalions. The creatures beneath the surface didn't hesitate. They surged upward, dragging Xilari warriors into the abyss. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers turned on each other, trampling their own as they fought to escape. Some fired blindly into the pits, only to be dragged down screaming. Others tried to flee back toward their warships, only to find that their landing zones were now crumbling ruins. From his vantage point, Elias watched the unstoppable Xilari army break. The aliens who had once conquered entire worlds without resistance were now fleeing in terror. And Elias? He smiled. Mission accomplished. The battlefield had turned into a nightmare. What was once a well-organized Xilari invasion force had become a chaotic mess of retreating soldiers, collapsing ground, and monstrous creatures surging from below. Smoke and dust filled the air, mingling with the cries of terrified warriors. Elias watched it all unfold from his elevated position, his visor picking up every detail. The Xilari were broken, just as he had planned. But he wasn't celebrating yet. There was still work to be done. Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. The detonations were a success, but we have a problem. Elias didn't like the sound of that. What is it? Briggs answered before Sarah could. The Xilari aren't the only ones panicking. Those creatures down there, they're getting bolder. Elias cursed under his breath. He had counted on the underground beasts being a wild card, but now they were unpredictable. The chaos had awakened them, and they were no longer content to stay in their pits. They were spreading. A deep guttural roar echoed across the battlefield. Sarah stiffened. Elias. Elias followed her gaze. Across the wasteland, rising from the largest sinkhole, was something bigger. Much bigger. The other creatures had been terrifying. Massive, fast, and deadly. But this was something else. Its body was covered in jagged, stone-like plating, its many limbs moving in unnatural, twisting motions. Its eyes, dozens of them, glowed like burning embers, locking onto everything that moved. It wasn't just a predator. It was the apex. And it was hungry. Briggs' voice was tight. Tell me that thing wasn't part of the plan. Elias clenched his jaw. Nope. That's new. General Vorik had never known fear. He had led countless invasions, crushed rebellions, and faced death without flinching. The auxiliary were superior, always. But now he felt something deeply unsettling. His forces were scattered. His warships couldn't land. His elite warriors were being hunted. And then, the ground trembled. Vorik turned. He saw it. The massive creature emerging from the sinkhole. The way it moved, effortless, powerful, sentient. It wasn't just attacking blindly. It was calculating, watching. A low growl vibrated through the air. Then, in a blur of movement too fast for something that size, the creature pounced. A squad of Silari warriors barely had time to react before jagged limbs impaled them. Their armor, supposedly impenetrable, crumpled like paper. The thing tore them apart effortlessly. Vorik's eyes widened. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre. He turned to his officers. Evacuate. Now. From the ridge, Elias saw it happen. The moment the auxiliary's last bit of discipline snapped, they ran. Full retreat. Their warships, struggling against the interference, began lifting off in a panic. Entire squads abandoned their weapons, desperate to escape. Briggs let out a low whistle. Well, that's one way to win a war. Sarah wasn't smiling. We need to go. Now. Elias knew she was right. The auxiliary might have been the original threat, but now they weren't the biggest one. The creatures weren't just hunting the enemy. They were spreading. He tapped his comms. All teams, fall back to the extraction point. Now. The squad moved fast, weaving through the rocky terrain. Behind them, the battlefield continued to fall apart. The massive creature let out a piercing screech, a sound so deep it rattled Elias' ribs. He risked one last look. The auxiliary were gone. Their mighty invasion force had been reduced to a handful of survivors, fleeing into orbit. But as Elias turned away, something caught his eye. The creature, it wasn't chasing them. It was watching. For the first time, Elias had the sinking feeling that it understood, and that terrified him more than anything. The ground still trembled beneath Elias' boots as he sprinted toward the extraction point, the air thick with dust and smoke. The battlefield, once a place of Silari dominance, was now an apocalyptic wasteland. Fires raged, the earth was fractured beyond recognition, and the alien beasts, awakened by the chaos, were tearing through anything in their path. But something was wrong. The creatures weren't chasing at random anymore. They were moving with purpose. Elias kept his eyes on the ridge ahead. His squad was close, too close to making it out of this alive for something to go wrong now. But instincts sharpened from years of war screamed at him. Something was wrong. Sarah's voice crackled through the comms. Elias, do you see this? He didn't need to ask what she meant. Ahead, just beyond the extraction point, a thick fog was creeping over the land. Unnatural, slow, deliberate. And then, through the haze, shapes began to emerge. Not the auxiliary, not the mindless beasts. Something else. Briggs swore under his breath. This isn't just an infestation. This is something worse. Elias' hands tightened around his weapon. The monstrous creatures that had overrun the battlefield were terrifying enough, but these new ones, they were different. They moved differently, with intelligence, with coordination, like an army, and they were waiting for them. Sarah's breathing was shaky. "Elias, tell me you have a plan." Elias' mind raced. He had been in impossible situations before, outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. But this wasn't war anymore. It was something bigger. A voice broke through the static of his comms, urgent and sharp. "Commander, this is Alpha 2. The extraction site is compromised. We have incoming." The transmission cut out. Then, from the mist, the attack came. A blur of motion, shadows twisting into something solid. Elias barely had time to yell a warning before the first strike hit. Something fast and unseen slammed into the squad's lead soldier, tearing through his armor like paper. The man didn't even scream, just vanished into the fog. Briggs fired into the mist, his weapon flashing bright, but nothing was there. No bodies, no movement, just silence. Then came the sound. A low clicking that reverberated through the ground, crawling under their skin. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural. It was communication. Elias knew then. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were being hunted. Sarah grabbed his arm. "We have to move. Now." He didn't argue. "Fall back. Regroup at secondary coordinates." The squad turned and ran, pushing through the thickening fog, barely able to see more than a few feet ahead. Shadows loomed in the mist, moving with inhuman speed. Something screeched, a sound that made Elias' blood turn to ice. Then another soldier was pulled into the darkness. "This time," he screamed. Briggs spun, his rifle blazing, but it was useless. The enemy was too fast, too precise. Elias forced his mind to stay sharp. Think. Adapt. Survive. The creatures weren't attacking like mindless monsters. They were targeting the weakest links, testing their defenses, learning. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a trap. A new voice came over the comms, gravelly, battle-worn, and barely keeping the panic out. "Commander, this is Captain Rourke. We're pinned down. We need immediate evac, or we're not making it out." Elias checked his HUD. Rourke's team was southwest, too far for a quick extraction, too close to leave behind. Briggs' jaw tightened. "If we go after them, we're dead too." Elias already knew that, but he also knew what Rourke's squad carried: a classified weapon, something the enemy couldn't get their hands on. If the creatures reached them first. Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "We can't let that happen." Elias exhaled slowly. He had a choice: run, and leave Rourke's team to die, or turn back, knowing full well they might not survive either. A heartbeat of silence. Then Elias lifted his weapon. "We go back." No hesitation. Because if these creatures were smart enough to set a trap, then they needed to prove that humans were smarter. The air was thick with tension, each breath laced with dust and fear. Elias and his squad pressed forward, the swirling fog obscuring their vision, distorting sound, turning every shadow into a potential threat. The enemy was out there, lurking, waiting, hunting them. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle, his heartbeat steady despite the chaos around him. The decision had already been made. They were going back for Rourke's team, no matter the cost. Briggs moved beside him, muttering under his breath, his usual bravado replaced by grim determination. "This is suicide. Man." Sarah shot him a glare. "Then let's make sure we don't die." The squad advanced through the ruins, their footsteps careful, their senses sharp. The landscape was barely recognizable now. A twisted wreck of metal and stone, fires flickering in the distance. This had once been a battlefield, but now it was something worse. A hunting ground. Elias activated his comms. "Rourke, respond." Static. Then, "We're pinned. 5 of us left. Hostiles everywhere. Gunfire crackled through the transmission, followed by a guttural screech that made Elias' blood run cold. Briggs cursed. They're getting torn apart. Elias picked up the pace. Move. Now. They surged forward, pushing through the haze. Every step felt like walking deeper into the jaws of something waiting to swallow them whole. Then, ahead. Movement. Elias raised his fist, signaling the squad to halt. His HUD barely registered anything, but he knew they were not alone. A shape shifted in the fog. Then another. Not Xelari. Not the mindless beasts from before. These were the new ones. The real enemy. Sarah whispered, "They're adapting." Briggs gritted his teeth. "Then we adapt faster." Elias scanned their surroundings, searching for an opening. They had to get to Rourke before it was too late. But the creatures were circling, studying them, testing them. Then, without warning, they attacked. A blur of motion, a shadow lunging from the mist. Elias barely had time to react before a soldier was dragged screaming into the fog. Gunfire erupted. Muzzles flashed, lighting up the haze in bursts of fire and death. But the creatures were too fast, moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. They were learning. Another scream. Another soldier gone. Elias didn't hesitate. Fallback formation. Close ranks. Don't let them separate us. The squad shifted, moving as one, their backs nearly touching. But the creatures kept coming. Then, through the chaos, a signal, a beacon from Rourke's last position. Sarah gasped. They're still alive. Elias didn't waste time. He tossed a smoke grenade, the thick cloud expanding instantly, covering their retreat. Move. Now. They sprinted through the ruins, the creatures chasing but momentarily disoriented. The signal was growing stronger. Then, a flash of movement. Elias raised his weapon, finger tightening on the trigger, only to freeze. A soldier. Rourke's team. Bloodied, limping, but alive. Elias grabbed him, pulling him into cover. "Where's Rourke?" The man's face was pale. "Inside, but they're coming." Then, as if summoned by his words, they arrived. A wall of shadows rose from the fog, moving as one, surrounding the ruined structure where Rourke and his team were trapped. Elias had seconds to decide. Briggs exhaled sharply. "We're out of time." Sarah looked at Elias. "What's the call?" Elias clenched his jaw. No retreat. No surrender. They were taking Rourke back, even if they had to drag him through hell to do it. The ruins trembled under the weight of distant explosions, and the thick fog twisted around the broken metal and stone, making the battlefield feel like an open grave. The enemy was near, watching, waiting. Elias adjusted his grip on his rifle, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion settling into his muscles. There was no turning back now. Rourke and his team were trapped inside the crumbling structure ahead. And the creatures, the ones that had been learning their tactics, were closing in. They had to act. Now. Briggs crouched beside him, his face pale beneath the flickering light of a nearby fire. "This is the worst plan we've ever had." Sarah smirked despite the tension. "That's why it's going to work." Elias ignored them both, his mind racing. The creatures had adapted to their previous strategies, countering their formations and anticipating their moves. If they charged in head-on, they'd be slaughtered before reaching the entrance. But he had one last trick up his sleeve. He tapped his comm. "Rourke, listen carefully. We're coming in hot. When I give the signal, set off your remaining charges at the west entrance. That should drive them right into our sights." A pause. Then Rourke's strained voice. "Copy that. You better move fast." Elias turned to his squad. "We split up. Sarah, Briggs, you take high ground and rain hell from above. Keep their eyes on you. The rest of us push forward through the east side and take them from behind. We force them into a bottleneck, and when Rourke blows the charges, we finish the job. Briggs gave a tight nod. Guess we'll find out if we're crazier than they are. Sarah was already moving, disappearing into the wreckage above. Elias took a slow breath, then raised his fist. Go. The squad moved like shadows through the ruins, their steps light, their weapons steady. Elias could feel it. The enemy knew something was happening. The mist around them seemed to shift, as if the creatures were adjusting, responding. They were ready for them. But Elias wasn't relying on the obvious. He was about to do something they wouldn't expect. The first shot rang out. Sarah, firing from above, her rifle cracking through the silence. Briggs followed, a grenade sailing through the fog before exploding in a violent burst of fire and smoke. The creatures reacted instantly, their unnatural screeches cutting through the air. They turned toward the gunfire, their grotesque forms shifting, moving. The moment they turned, Elias and his team struck. They opened fire in controlled bursts, their bullets ripping through the creature's armor like skin. The beasts recoiled, their movements jerky and erratic as they tried to reposition. Then, Rourke detonated the charges. The explosion roared through the ruins, shaking the ground, sending debris flying. Flames burst outward, forcing the creatures directly into Elias' line of fire. And then, they charge. Not mindlessly, not in a frenzy. With purpose. They had learned again, adapted again. Elias barely had time to react before one of the creatures leaped from the smoke, its bladed limbs slashing through the air. He ducked, rolling just as it landed where he had stood a second ago. His rifle came up, too slow. The creature struck. A blur of motion, then a gunshot. Briggs' shot ripped through its skull. Elias didn't hesitate. He was already moving, already firing, already fighting. The battlefield had become a whirlwind of chaos. Gunfire, explosions, screams, and the nightmarish shrieks of the creatures refusing to die. They fought with everything they had, but the creatures were relentless. One of Elias' men was dragged into the fog, gone. Sarah shouted over the comms, "We can't hold this position." Elias gritted his teeth, his mind racing. There was one last move to play. His fingers flew over his wrist console, overriding the fail-safe protocols. Briggs saw what he was doing and swore, "You're gonna bring the whole place down." Elias didn't stop. Exactly. He activated the last remaining charges buried beneath the ruins, the ones they weren't supposed to use. The ground trembled. The creatures hesitated. Elias smirked. Time to run. The squad bolted, sprinting toward Rourke's position as the entire battlefield collapsed behind them. The creatures screeched, some crushed beneath the falling debris, others scrambling in confusion. The mist itself seemed to howl as the ruins were swallowed by dust and fire. Elias didn't stop running until he saw Rourke. Alive. Bloodied, but alive. They barely made it inside before the final explosion rocked the area, sealing the entrance behind them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Rourke exhaled a shaky breath. "You're insane." Elias smirked, leaning against the wall, his breath ragged. Crazy enough to work. The battle wasn't over, but they had survived. For now.